So finally we reached the top 3 in my playlist of top 10 favorite chess games. This one is the most famous brilliancy by Rashid Nizamedinov with black pieces, the most attacking player I would say ever, who created 2 masterpieces, and 2 of his games are in my top 3 favorite chess games. And this is the first one. It's against Lev Polgaevsky, played in Rostov. And, well, let's just see and appreciate how brilliant this chess game is. So, Polgaevsky played d4, knight f6, c4, and here d6. This is not very common, but often it transposes to King's Indian or to some other Indian variation. Knight c3 and e5. This is known as the Old Indian defense, the Ukrainian variation. It may be tempting for white to perhaps liquidate to this endgame and maybe try to win something very quickly, but it's not really the case, I would say. This position is not anything particularly great. If knight here, then simply king e7, and black is standing very well. And in this endgame has absolutely no problems. But I think this would be a good choice, since Rashid Nizamedinov was known for his tactical abilities, and white should rather try to liquidate into an endgame instead of going for some tactical variations. But okay, that was his decision. He played e4, simply taking over the center. Rashid exchanged and played knight c6, kicking the queen away from the center. Queen d2, g6. So now he's simply preparing to bring his bishop, his bishop over to this long diagonal and pressurize black's position, b3, which means that white really has to develop this bishop very quickly, because after bishop g7 there is a tactical motif with knight takes e4, which after it is recaptured, actually bishop takes rook on a1. So white really has to develop the bishop to b2 now, and the black castles. So he already completed his development. As we can see, he got his king to safety and has most of his minor pieces developed. White is a little bit behind in the development, but he has a better control in the center and a nice grip for the knight on the d5 square. So bishop d3, developing a piece. And here knight g4. So we see the first sort of aggressive attempt by Rashid Nizamedinov. So already capitalizing on this, let's say, maybe not capitalizing, but putting pressure on this f2 square, getting ready to maybe get the queen to the action, also making room for this pawn to advance. A lot of options. And here Polgaevsky makes the first rather, I would say, passive decision. He plays knight g2. A better move was knight f3, from where the knight controls the h4 and g5 squares, so that the queen cannot join the attack. But he decided to play knight e2 and queen h4 by Nizamedinov. So he's putting a lot of pressure on f2, actually threatening to take this one. So it has to be blocked. Polgaevsky played knight g3, which is a mistake. G3 was slightly better, because if after it's played the queen has to move away, but he probably didn't play that because he was sort of maybe afraid of what happens if the queen comes to h3. But knight f4 simply solves all the problems, and in here white would be okay. But he played knight g3 instead. Maybe he wanted also some control of these 2 squares, I don't know. And in here knight g5. Well, knight g5 puts pressure on the bishop so that the queen has to babysit it, but also makes sort of a way to maybe pressure the pawn with the queen. Also takes the f4 square under control, because in the previous move it's strategically possible for white to get the queen to f4, h3, and well, then the queen may find itself in trouble. So after knight e5, white castled, and black started the attack, f5. So of course it is possible to take, but after this variation, black gets to develop another piece with tempo and has a great control of these two bishops. I would say this position is preferable for black. Of course, there is a move like queen to d5 check, after which king h8, and white is not like losing, but I think this position is much more pleasant for black since he has these pieces being very active and controlling a lot of space. So after f5, f3 was played, so maintaining the pawn in the center. If black ever decides to take it, Paul Gajewski is going to be ready to take back with a pawn and still have a good position in the center with his pawns. Bishop h6. So the bishop is no longer useful on g7, nothing is attacking the knight. So he plays bishop h6 in order to just get this queen off this diagonal. Remember, the queen still has to watch the bishop on d3, so this was the only move actually. Well, if you ever move to one of these two squares, then of course knight d4 will hurt because it will kick the queen away. So queen d1 and f4. So the pawn on f4 is actually becoming an attacking piece, moves with tempo on the knight and will prove to be dangerous. So after knight g2, g5, marching on to the white king, also reinforcing the pawn on f4. Knight to d5, so possibly attacking the c7 square, maybe even threatening knight f6 in some lines. So white is trying to get some counterplay going, but black's attack is very fast. He plays g4, so he really is getting ready maybe to take here and open the g file, maybe to play g3 and attack on h2. We shall see. In fact, g3 is a terrible threat. For instance, if white decides to maybe win a pawn, then he's actually immediately losing after g3. There's actually no defense to queen takes h2 without giving up a lot of material. If you think you can play h3, you lose, because after bishop takes on h3, you cannot recapture really. The best move is like bishop takes e5 and maybe trying to exchange something, but of course after bishop takes on g2 you continue to threaten mate, and well, here white would simply need to give up the knight, and it's like mate in 6. So I can show it to you. Of course white will first give up all of his pieces, but it doesn't matter after bishop here and bishop here, king f1, and that's mate immediately after queen takes on f2 is mate. So so you cannot do that. You cannot allow the pawn to g3 and meet it with h3. The best move actually, just to show you how desperate this position is simply rook f2, after which, well, you take this pawn and you take the rook, and this is absolutely winning for black, of course. So that's why you cannot allow g3, but there is not really a good way to prevent g3. Paul Gajewski tried it, playing g3 himself to block the g-pawn, but this didn't really work out. Nesmetinov took on g3. Of course, he took back. He has to do it with a pawn. If he does so with a knight, then rook takes f3 is very strong, winning another pawn. Getting the knight here, this is surely losing. The bishop also gets involved anytime soon, so he shouldn't allow that. So he recaptured with the h-pawn, and here queen h3. So currently there might be a threat of potential, this is a strategical threat, that there is a bishop e3 which is mate, just, or forces to give the, white will be forced to give the exchange back, or not back, rather give the exchange for free. Of course, white does not have time to take here. If he does so, then of course this is completely hopeless. After knight takes f3 is checkmate. So in here white played f4, which seems to be a good move. simply kicking the knight away, locking down this rook, not allowing this pawn to move away. Basically, it's the best move in the position, but it still allows black a big initiative. He played bishop e6, so he doesn't really care about this knight hanging, because, well, if it's taken, then obviously after bishop takes d5, if this is recaptured, even though it really shouldn't, but if it is, then this is actually mate nearly immediately. I guess this is checkmate. Yeah, it is. Bishop e6 here, very strong. White does not have time to take the knight with a pawn, so he plays bishop c2, sidestepping from the potential threat of knight taking the bishop. Now the queen no longer has to babysit the d3 square. But it doesn't really matter. Nesmedinov is simply getting another piece involved. I mean, he's preparing to do that, because rook f7 is not only aimed to defend the c7 pawn, but it also makes room for the other rook to come into the action, and it also allows for possible rook g7, going for the king. And here, white is still unable to take the knight due to simple bishop takes d5, and still if you take back, that's mate immediately. Of course, you don't have to take the bishop. You may try to do it this way, but of course, this is not going to help you. There are simply too many threats. If you just, I don't know, take this one, the knight f3 is very strong. Simply hopeless position. If king e3 in this one, then queen takes h6 with check, and after say king here, then bishop takes on c4 is not a tactical motif. If you ever take this bishop, of course, then you lose very quickly after knight e5, king c3. If you try to run simply, you don't really have a place to cover. If here, then rook takes f1, so already dropping another piece, and this is actually made very quickly. If you go here, then it's knight c4, king c1, check, and mate. This is just the example, of course. There are many lines, but they're all winning for black. If you want, you can work them out yourself. But that's why basically you cannot take the knight on e5. That's very deep calculation by Nesmedinov. So white simply panicked at this point and decided to flee from the king's side, simply maybe trying to get this king somehow to the queen side where it's a little safer. But Nesmedinov executes with style. Queen h2 check. So, okay, king e3. So, as planned, king runs into the queen side. And it may seem that, okay, bishop takes d5, so eliminating the defender. This was taken back, and knight b4. So, another piece is in the attack. And, of course, it's not possible to take the knight due to the pin now. So, it all seems great for black, but it seems that as if rook to h1 is simply winning a piece, a queen even, I would say. A queen for a rook. The queen has absolutely nowhere to go, and that's the move played by Paul Glajewski. And it was in this position where one of the greatest moves of all time was played, I would say. An absolutely brilliant combination that Nesmedinov had to see a couple of moves ago, simply for this whole attack to make sense. So, yeah, I'll just show it to you. You won't find it. Rook takes f4. A brilliant move, sacrificing the queen and the rook at the same time. So, okay, in the game he took the queen. I mean, what else is there? If you take the rook in any possible way, if you take the rook with a knight, say, then queen takes g3. And, well, you cannot go back with the king, because if you do so, then you simply lose your knight. And, well, the mate soon follows. All of these pieces are simply ready to kill the white king. If rook g1, okay, queen to h2 check even is possible, but I think queen e3 wins just as well. Yes, it does. It's actually mate in 7. Yeah, it wins even more. So after king here, just rook f8. Now, after the bishop moves, the king will not be in a pleasant position. So, okay, if you try to take it with a pawn instead, and well, then simply bishop takes f4 again, and if knight takes f4, we go back to this variation where we capture here, check, and say, well, actually you have to give up the queen, because the king has nowhere to go. As you can see, these knights, this knight controls these squares, this knight controls these squares, and the queen controls all this rank, so the king has nowhere to go, and the queen has to be given up. This is of course totally winning for black. Not only is he up in the material, but he also has a great initiative and an attack. So you cannot take the rook, so what happens if the queen is taken, as in the game? Well, Nezmetinov, after the queen was taken, Nezmetinov played rook f3 check. So, alright, there's only one legal move here, king d4, and Nezmetinov played bishop to g7. It was better to play c5, because after c5, white really has no hope of surviving this. Actually, after b5, absolutely there is no defense here. As you can see, the king is completely cut off, so it's just enough to give him one check, and then the game is over. If, say, bishop d3, then, well, knight takes c6, and if king c3, bishop to g7 check, king d2. This is the line given by the computer, which, well, I would say is simply winning. By all means, you don't even take the queen, you just take the bishop. The queen cannot do anything. If you try to save your queen, then you lose another exchange. Not even winning an exchange, if you recapture, you lose a queen. That's just overwhelming tactics. So, okay, but Nezmetinov didn't play c5, he played bishop g7, which is just as much poisons as the c5 move, but it's not like engine accurate. Of course, it's still completely winning for black from human perspective, but the engine actually gives a drawing line after a very subtle move, knight g1, after which, well, there is absolutely no way to win with black. The rook's position is being challenged, so he has to move it, and moving it doesn't really do anything. And if you play c5, you may actually try to maybe potentially, I would say, do something. I mean, you can give this check, but after all these things are given up, in the end, actually, there is nothing better for black than a draw. And it would end this way, with a draw by perpetual check. But of course, Polgaevsky is not a computer, neither is Nezmetinov, and he played pawn to a4, preventing b5, which is vital in some of these variations. The main line simply goes c5, b takes, and then afterwards, well, if it's not taken, then if king goes over to c4, then of course b5 wins. So this one prevents such a possibility. So after a4, c5 was played, d takes c6, b takes c6, and bishop d3. Bishop d3 has to be played to allow the king to go back to c3. So currently, black is actually threatening to run away, but black gives him no chance. Knight takes on d3 check, so the bishop this time cuts off the king from the c3 square. So the king has to march on to c4, and then here it's forced mate. After d5 check, the only move, and again, you just have to see and admire the fact that all of these squares are covered. The only move is to take the pawn, and after it's taken again, check. King has to go to b5, rook to b8 was played, king a5 is the only move, knight c6, the only move is king a6, and the game ends with a beautiful checkmate with knight to c5. So how often do you get to see such an artistic checkmate after such a brilliant combination? I think this is a true masterpiece, and definitely, if not higher, it should at least be at the third place of this rating. Even though Rashid Nizmedinov has never even achieved a title of Grandmaster, I think for this game, an artistry that he's shown in this game, he should be awarded all possible titles in the world, because I think this is one of the most beautiful games ever, and one of the most beautiful games possible. So I hope you enjoyed this one, and I would simply just for a moment want to go back to this position in which Nizmedinov found. I mean, he probably saw that, like, at this point, after he played Queen H2, he probably had to see that tactic with Rook takes F4 is actually working, but how much of a genius do you need to be to see such a move a lot of time before you play it? For me, that's true sorcery, I would say. So I hope you enjoyed this one. I mean, I'm sure you enjoyed this one. So see you in the next one, in the game number 2, which was also played by Rashid Nizmedinov. So I hope that one is not going to be any worse than this one. I think it's even better, that's why it's on the number 2. So thank you, bye, and see you in the next video.